Okie dokie. Well, hello, everyone. I'm librarian Faith from the Mandel Public Library of West Palm Beach. And today we are being joined by Colonel Alfred Biegel. He has 50 years of combined military and intelligence service. He served 26 years with the U.S. Army, including several tours of combat duty in Vietnam. And then he served an additional 25 years with the National Intelligence Community. After retiring from U.S. government service, he continues to lecture on relevant political military issues dealing with the crisis-prone Middle East and other major global hotspots to various universities, colleges, academic think tanks, social organizations, and life learning institutes. Colonel Biegel has earned 3 master's degrees on political military subjects dealing with Russia, China, and global conflict. Moreover, he continues to lecture on these topics annually to various social clubs and libraries in Columbia, Maryland, and lifelong learning centers throughout the Boca Raton, Delray Beach, and Palm Beach area of Southern Florida. As a member of APAC, he participates in local, regional, and national conferences and is a former board member of the Florida Society of Middle East Studies at Florida Atlantic University. Additionally, Colonel Biegel regularly participates with various think tank seminars held at the Wilson Center, Keenan Institute, Brookings Institute, as well as the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. And without further ado, here he is.
Hi, folks. This is a pleasure to be able to talk about something I'm somewhat familiar with. We're going to talk mostly on drones and then the follow-on means of warfare that is now taking root significantly and substantially based on recent conflicts between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Israel, as well as Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it'll become a little clearer as we go on in terms of what the future looks like. First of all, the first form of drone warfare, where it's not only surveillance, but target acquisition and sending bombs over terrain at the same time. When did that first take place? It took place in Venice when the Austrians were at war with the Italians and they assaulted the city. And from a ship, which is a precursor to aircraft carriers, the ship was called Vancano. And what they did is they had these 200 huge balloons which carried 25, 30-pound bombs. And the objective was to drift over to the city and somehow using men on the ground guide the balloons over Venice and drop those bombs. The only problem here historically was the fact that the wind changed and the balloons shifted over to the ship itself. So that was 172 years ago. It didn't work. But in Vietnam, one of my assignments in the early 70s was to become a G2 air, and over some combat situations, the G2 air, I had 18 aircraft under my operational control. And the fact is, when you were trying to find out whether the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were using the Ho Chi Minh trails, you couldn't do that from a jet aircraft with the canopy so thick. So you go with what you have. And I had 18 aircraft, which were one-engine aircraft, a pilot and a fellow like me in the back with a handheld camera. And what we would do is fly over and at least acquire a target and then arrange to have fighter aircraft or B-52s over those targets if we found something. So I filled up a lot of bad barf bags and lost a lot of weight. But anyway, that was the beginning. So let's go into the briefing with that introduction. this is what I'm going to talk about. You can skim through this. I won't dwell on it. But again, Nagorno-Karabakh was critical in terms of the strategy where a country who could not afford to have an air force can get away on the cheap with drones. And that's the way Azerbaijan defeated its adversary, Armenia, despite the fact Armenia had backing of Russia, as well as to a degree with Iran. Drones dominated the battlefield, and the Israelis provided most of the drones, and we'll go and see how that happened. And we'll go through various examples to prove the point. And how do you defeat the drone in the future? Well, the Israelis are struggling with that, as well as the United States. And that's where lasers come in. And the future beyond drones and lasers is artificial intelligence, and using that as a means to control the battlefield. And we're going to talk a little about our own U.S. defense strategic priorities and answer your questions. Next slide. This is what we saw in September of last year. Since the 1990s, Armenia and Azerbaijan have been fighting over this territory called Nagorno-Karabakh. And Armenia had a relationship with Russia that it would come to its aid if it were attacked. And Turkey, on the other hand, was on the other side, was on the side of Azerbaijan. And as Turkey is now involved on the other side of Russia, and this goes back historically for hundreds of years. So in terms of Azerbaijani troops, I'm going to let you go through this slide, and you can see that they were relatively, in terms of the battlefield, equal in a way. The difference is that Azerbaijan and Israel had a strategic pact, and the Israelis, in order to get oil from Azerbaijan, traded off the Israeli Harpy drone. This Harpy drone is called a loitering or suicide drone. The Turks, on the other hand, provided their own drone capabilities. But we found that during the battle, if you do not have air power, supremacy of the air, the likelihood of you winning on the battlefield is slim. So despite the comparative amount of equipment both had, it was the drones that won the conflict. Armenia had more money, certainly, than Azerbaijan. And despite the air defense support provided by Russian equipment, it did not serve to do it because the Azeri forces had sufficient numbers of drones. Next slide, please. Now, the Armenians blamed the Israelis and Turkey for their defeat. And certainly Armenian protests all over the world, it didn't help. It's what is on the battlefield that does count beyond protests. The Turkish elements brought in Syrian mercenaries, and again, the Azerbaijanis had sufficient use of loitering drones that were called kamikaze, and they were decisive. So the Armenians' battlefield losses are written here, but they lost about over 4,000 troops in a short period of time. It was 44 days in September of last year that the battle continued, but the Russians did everything they can to stop it, and brought in 2,000 peacekeepers. And of course, the Armenians losing the war and realistically facing the obvious, they had to surrender and give up territory. And in the 90s, they went to war over this. Azerbaijani always lost on the battlefield because the Armenians had Russian support and better equipment, but no drones. The key point here I want to make is that Russian arms, particularly their vaunted air defense systems, proved ineffective, with a lot of negative implications for future global arms sales. And next slide. The Armenia-Azerbaijani peace deal, if you look at the colors in terms of what was lost to the Armenians, that's in the dark colors that you see. Again, Armenia as a country, Nagorno-Karabakh happens to be between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And again, that's been contested for many, many years. Again, let's see, over 2,000 Russian peacekeepers went in quickly. They're quite concerned about Turkish inroads because they face the Turks not only in Syria, but also in Libya on opposing sides. So the last thing the Russians want in their area of interest is chaos of any sort, which could unleash problems with the various ethnic Turks and ethnic Muslims in the Transcaucasus. So snuffing that out was critical. Next slide. And we can see Armenia. We can see in pink, that's where Nagorno-Karabakh is. And again, the Russians have an agreement with Armenia that if their territory is encroached upon, they will come to its aid. Azerbaijan is supported by the Turks. But strategically, something very crucial is we can look at the distance between Israel and Iran. Iran is the existential threat for Israel, particularly with its working on nuclear capabilities. And they have now established landing rights just north of Iran in Azerbaijan. And that is part of the reason why Israel has been providing the equipment, drones, and other capabilities, stations that control the drones, because of its strategic concerns against Iran. Iran, of course, is quite worried about that link between Israel and Azerbaijan, because if war takes place between those two countries, rather than have their aircraft make a turnaround from those areas of the nuke sites, they can just go and land in Azerbaijan. That's a major strategic point. So this shows you Georgia not having friendly relations with Russia, having some conflict scenarios, as well as Armenia. Armenia is being supported by who else? Iran. because of the fact that Azerbaijan is too close to Israel. Next slide. This is important. Not only are the landing rights in terms of strategic links, but Iran has 25% of its population, 25% of 80 million, over 20 million Azeris, an ethnic minority that have a great deal of allegiance to Azerbaijan rather than Iran. And so that is a domestic concern for the Iranian regime. And the fear of overflow of this conflict into Iran is something the Iranians want to tamp down very quickly. They've got enough problems with its adversaries in the Middle East, and that's a concern. The Russians were overflying military supplies to Armenia during the conflict. All of a sudden, when that hit the press, the Azeris, in quite a number, thousands, hit the streets and protested Iranian allowance of that fact, and they pressured the leadership of Iran to give verbal support for Azerbaijan. So both Iran and Russia are accusing Turkey, as well as Israel, of fueling the ethnic conflict. So the Israeli arms export to Azerbaijan has opened a major and significant strategic front. And the picture below Ali Khamenei, who happens to be an ethnic Azeri and understands the import, he followed his own population's concern when they protested across Iran. Next slide. Okay, the wake-up call. Iran actually provided a wake-up call to all the countries in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, when they, if you see the slide on the lower left, and that was the damage to one of the major Saudi Arabian oil production. This is September 2019. If you notice, they use precision-guided munitions, whether cruise missiles or drones, to destroy 20% of the Saudi oil reserves. And so when that happened, most of the nations in the Gulf, including Israel, were profoundly shocked. And as you can see today, Israel has taken many military measures against Iran, particularly to destroy any aspects, any inkling of where precision-guided munitions might be manufactured along its borderland. They've taken the offensive. We remember that during the Trump administration, when the Iranians were upset because of the sanctions, they destroyed an RQ-4 Global Hawk. And the problem is nothing happened when they did that. It was $150 million aircraft, drone. And there was a big debate in DOD, et cetera, on what to do in terms of retaliation. But when Tucker Carlson of Fox News warned the president that he'd lose the election if he got himself into a conflict with Iran, what happened? Nothing. Nothing was done. Not until the killing of Soleimani at a later date, when it continued. The Iranian drones are now being provided to the Houthi proxies in Yemen, and the Saudi Arabians are concerned. 860 drones have been fired from Yemen against their capital, against their air bases, and against their other infrastructure. And so here's an area where their link with Israel can get them some air defense equipment that is quite effective to prevent these Iranian drones fired from Yemen to destroy them, to destroy their infrastructure. So we remember when it took a US drone strike to kill Soleimani, as well as the head of the Kataib Hezbollah, El Mohandes, to restore deterrence finally in January of 2020. Next slide. So Israel at this time, because of the Iranian use of PGMs, precision guided munitions, they're destroying everything they can get, they can see, based on their excellent intelligence. So they've been certainly hitting Syria, locations in Iraq, as well as Lebanon, as well as in Iran itself. So far, everything has been on a relatively low level. The Iranians have not responded to Israel in the same way. Next slide. We're at the point now where drones, you have both proxy and terrorist use of this equipment. So the major problem for the West is to determine what we can do to counter this buildup of drones. The Iranians have tactical drone batteries, and quite a bit launched from land and sea. And as well as these, you can buy miniature drones commercially all over the world, all over the globe. And in fact, the Houthis have been trained by the Iranians to even build their own drones, as well as the Iranians building their own suicide or loitering drones in Yemen within range of Israel. And the issue here is that you had a chief captain who worked for Soleimani in the Quds force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And the Quds force is the overseas special forces contingent that works directly with proxies. And so the threat of having these drones, which are located in Yemen, possibly be a new launch point, not only against Saudi Arabia, which it is on a weekly basis at least, but against Israel. They have not fired yet, but the Israelis are building up their air defense capabilities, very effective air defense capabilities, to prevent that. Next slide. Israel leads in global drone sales, 60% of the global exports. It's followed by the US and China. The US has been using drones since early 9/11, 2001, primarily in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, etc. Pakistan in particular, against Al-Qaeda and against Taliban. The Israelis, which account for the 60%, and they have drones as large as a 737 Boeing, and they can stay up for over 20 hours, some of them as long as 72 hours. 50 nations operate Israeli military drones. The United States does less exporting, but has been improving its drone capability quite well. If you look at YouTube, you'll see that the United States is experimenting with dropping drones from fighter aircraft. In fact, drone swarms. Can you imagine, in terms of reducing the air defense footprint against a U.S. air assault, that a U.S. fighter can drop 1,000 mini drones to confuse adversarial radar footprints. And we're moving out quite rapidly in that respect, and so are our adversaries. The Israelis are producing vertical takeoff drones. You don't need an airfield, etc. You just need to just keep it outside the door and let it go. The drones, in terms of Israel, I'm bringing Israel primarily up, is 80% of their operational flight hours are now performed by unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. That's quite a difference. And the reason Israel got into the drone warfare since 85, in fact, after 73, when they lost so many aircraft and men and pilots flying over Egypt against Russian air defense, Soviet air defense capabilities, they determined that unmanned aerial surveillance, as well as target acquisition and kill power, was the way to go. The one aspect that helps in terms of making the budget more amenable is that drones provide a capability to reduce civilian casualties or collateral damage, and they can still be used for targeted assassinations. Next slide, please. Even now, the Israelis, as well as the United States, for somehow finding out that the best units in terms of deployment of drones happen to be female tactical drone units. They've deployed this right now to the northern borders against Hezbollah, and they find them to be exceedingly effective. The United States, now this army has changed since I've been there. They're deploying one drone unit to each infantry squadron. And that is definitely a move that can make a difference. This is primarily surveillance, but that will also lead to using the combat power on the ground to take out the enemy. The Sky Striker drones are these swarms of drones that the Israelis would use to overcome any adversarial air defense network. Next slide. How do you counter this move toward building up drones that is now being magnified in terms of all the national countries in terms of a view of the future battlefield? Well, the Israelis, supported by the United States, are leading the way in terms of how to do this. Iron Dome is something that the United States has funded and supported Israel in building up. And that proves to be very effective. Iron Dome is going through different iterations and improvements, and they can be effective against drone swarms. But at the same time, this is not cheap. It's costly to down a drone with a more expensive air defense capability. In the mid-range, this is short range, this goes after short-range rockets, etc. No other country except the United States and Israel have this capability at this time. We are far ahead of our adversaries across the globe with Israel. In the mid-range, we have been funding David Sling, which intercepts medium and long-range rockets, and as well as multiple rockets simultaneously. And then we're on our Arrow 4 iteration, which can offset adversarial ballistic missile capabilities. And very expensive, but in terms of the existential threat, they are making that investment for a mission seal. Next slide, please. So we're undergoing right now a global drone race, arms race. And as we see, there are a number of countries, more than about a dozen, that actually are using the drones. But many more countries now are developing it, and a lot of countries are importing the drones, as well as the support requirements from the countries that have them. So this map, which globals, you could see that Israel is #1 in terms of export, China #2 right now, catching up. Not really, it's going to take a while, but United States having the most capable drones, and those don't go anywhere outside of the States. But the smaller drones are going to each infantry squad, and that's significant. Next slide. How do you stop the drones in a way that is cost effective? And this is it, where laser weapons come in to counter the drones. As you can see, when you use a laser beam, that's $1. When you use air defense, that can be $500,000 down to several tens of thousands of dollars to knock out drones, aircraft, etc. So laser is the way to go, and that's the way the United States is heavily making its investments. And right now, if you shift over to the extreme right top, you can see that the Navy has drones that they're experimenting with that can knock out aircraft, drones, etc. The Army, if you look at the very bottom center, the Athena, 30 kilowatts of high-powered laser. A mile away, it can put this hole into a car. And this is at the beginning stages where the experimentation is going on. And the defense research elements within the United States are being funded to go ahead and do just this. And from aircraft, you have lasers. Under the naval system, all the way extreme right, in the middle, Israel is now using lasers also. And by 2022, if the predictions come right, it will have complete air defense coverage with lasers over the country of Israel. And that is something the Iranians have to be quite concerned about once Israel achieves that level of defense. So from land, from sea, and from air, lasers are being focused on by a number of countries. And the United States, I'm just going to make a guess, is doing what it can to stay in the lead. Next slide. So what do you have? The future battlefield. Take a look at C5ISR. Let's define what C5ISR is. And this is where the United States is moving in terms of its strategic investments. Okay, C5, command, control, communications, cyber, and computers, all wrapped up in that word. And then intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. So this shows you a map of the future battlefield. And we have developed commands, the US Cyber Command, the Space Command, and other commands to start really independently and in coordination with a supportive budget to invest in all these future capabilities. Even the man on the ground in terms of laser weaponry, all this is not being imagined, it's being tested at the present time. Which nation comes out first certainly will make a difference. And my guess is we are doing everything we can with the support of Israel and its startup nation to keep ahead and stay ahead in terms of electronics, in terms of reconnaissance, target acquisition, and kill capability. Next slide. What is DOD doing right now? That's Department of Defense, US. And this was in 2018, under the Trump administration, they had to prepare a mission statement of how they address future warfare. And if you just go through this, these words, I'm not going to read this, but in terms of drones, future battlefield, investment, innovation, lethal weaponry, drones, lasers, robotics, etc. And we're talking about artificial intelligence, and we're talking about strategic planning to stay ahead of key adversaries, particularly China, and secondly, Russia. And with our defense budget of about $750 billion a year and increasing with inflation, we're facing a China with a defense budget comparatively of a little over $200 billion per year. And Russia cannot have guns and butter. We're talking about $60 billion a year. And this is comparative, weighing everything. So the United States, in terms of our second key adversary, China, is more than 3 times the defense budget. And therefore, when it comes to many of these competitive areas, we have to be very critical in terms of what we read, in terms of gloom and doom, and whether the United States is being disarmed. We are continuing to explore this. The Biden administration has ordered the Department of Defense, General Austin, by this summer to have a strategic plan that will face and will keep ahead, particularly China. And by the end of the summer, this will be put in writing. So these are the major threats: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, in that order. And our US competitive military advantage has, yes, been eroding, But the wake-up call has taken place by Chinese not playing by global rules and demonstrating in the South China Sea a type of aggression, I would say. I can't call it anything else, building islands and attempting to proclaim that area, which is against the Geneva rules, that it's their particular territory. The United States has been sending aircraft carriers and advanced capabilities to that area. And again, if you look at China, it only has one aircraft carrier, oil powered. We have 20, 11 of which happen to be nuclear and have to be maintained once every 50 years. So DOD is reviewing this, and I'm not concerned about the balance of power. And with the US, along with its alliance capabilities in the Pacific with Japan, India, the Quad, Australia, and the European allies, I think we're on the right track. Next slide. So if we look at the digital dimension, which is crucial in terms of future battlefields, and this is my last slide, is we are investigating all the capabilities that are possible in terms of keeping us ahead. Wearable devices, sensors, robotics, all of these will take another briefing to go into individually. Artificial intelligence and the precision guided munitions, as well as armor to make the difference. Okay. So next slide. That completes my briefing, and I left enough time to answer as many questions, any question you may have on this or the current strategic aspects dealing with the United States, Israel, the Middle East, and our global alliances. Please, any questions?
Again, this is Librarian Faith, just jumping back in. If you'd like, you can type in a question for Colonel Biegel. Just want to click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and it'll pop up and you can type in your questions.
Okay. In fact, if you show the pictures of everybody, they can even raise their hands. Okay, side-by-side gallery. Okay, questions, anybody? Let's see. Well, I guess I gave you quite a bit to chew on.
Oh, I have a question that popped up. Are drones controlled by commercial satellite communications or other means? And that's by Patricia Brooks. Yeah,
Pat, nice to hear from you. They can be controlled by commercial satellite too. Yes, there are many ways of controlling drones, either by specialized aircraft, electronic ELINT aircraft, but absolutely hooking them up with the satellite communications, military, most likely military rather than commercial. When it comes to satellites, I must tell you that the United States has gone into Space Force primarily to defend our satellites. Number one, I would think that the United States would have a first strike capability, and that's why they came up with a Space Force, because the Chinese have been actively working on how to destroy satellites in space. So how do you defend them? The United States will have defensive means, and we have capabilities now in space. Most of this is beyond my availability in terms of classification, but what I did read, and much of this is on YouTube, if one starts looking, is that the United States has asked China to let's discuss satellites, first strike, second strike, etc. But in the meantime, we're going to develop a capability to make sure he who knocks out an adversary's satellites blinds them. So this is so fundamental and crucial to US strategists. I hope that answers your question. Neil, it's scary? No, it isn't. That's the way. Deterrence. Deterrence is built to defend and prevent warfare. When the cost is so high to an adversary, and in the nuclear age itself, it makes all our strategists, we and our adversaries, think twice about opening certain boxes. After all, we've used a nuclear weapon in World War II. It has not been used against a nation in 70 years. So deterrence can work, but you have got to make the investments, and that is for the United States to defend against any adversarial capability that can undermine deterrence. Now, how long will it take for the world to destroy itself with these futures? It's a good question, but it won't. Destruction is something as long as leaders are rational, and I believe that the Chinese and Russians are rational, and certainly we are. And so unless we have a threat from an external world, global entity, which will unify our world, we shall continue. The march of technology will continue whether we like it or not. And 1849, we've gone a long way from balloons, trying to attack an adversary. Deterrence is our only hope to save ourselves in terms of the future.